Chapter 31. The black, opaque water suddenly surged and seethed, as though a living creature desperately trying to avoid the pale light of the coming dawn. Sunny slowly rose and, after some thought, carefully approached the edge of the stone platform. Looking down, he blinked and then kneeled to make sure that what he saw wasn't an illusion. The sea seemed to be receding. Slowly at first, and then faster and faster, the water level was dropping. The circular stone formation he had been taking shelter on used to barely protrude out of the waves, but now there were meters and meters of wet rock between him and the restless surface of the sea. As the sun climbed up, the monstrous ebb tide continued. Soon, Sunny found himself standing on the edge of a tall cliff, with 100-meter drop separating him from the churning waters. Beneath him, the rock formation broadened and changed shape. However, from his vantage point, it was hard to determine what that shape was, exactly. At that time, the dark surface of the water began to be punctured here and there by sharp crimson blades. As it dropped even further, it was as though a crimson forest was slowly rising from the black depths. The trees were made of something resembling coral, growing chaotically into each other and stretching toward the sky. They were colossal in size, with irregular protrusions entwining and merging together, looking monumental and eerie in the black and red reality of the sunlit void. The labyrinth formed by this strange reef stretched as far as Sunny could see, broken here and there by protruding cliffs, sudden chasms, and distant natural features. Half an hour later, utterly shocked, Sunny stared down and realized that the sea was completely gone. If not for the black seaweed left hanging on wet rocks and scarlet pillars of coral, he would even doubt if it was ever there. His small circular island had turned into the peak of a strange, towering, irregularly shaped cliff. Looking down, he felt his head spinning. By then, the night had already fully retreated, letting morning finally take its place. I'm not seeing things, am I? Sunny thought, pinching himself. What the spell was that? Despite the sudden disappearance of the dark sea and its hidden monsters, Sunny was in no rush to climb down from his circular stone platform. Firstly, he felt that if the sea was able to disappear, it was surely able to come back, perhaps at any moment. Secondly, he did not know what dangers the coral labyrinth was hiding. Perhaps there was something even scarier than the owner of the giant tentacle down there. But that did not mean that he wasn't going to explore. Coming back to his spot in the middle of the platform, Sunny sat down and commanded his shadow to separate itself from his body. Then, taking control of it, he approached the edge of the platform and nimbly slid down. Habitually moving from one shadow to another, he began the descent. At this moment, Sunny was glad that shadows had no weight and were not affected by gravity. While the shadow was busy climbing down, Sunny yawned. Say, don't you think that you need a name? Although his shadow was already too far away to hear him, they still could communicate through their shared connection. Of course, the fact that it could did not mean that it would. The shadow was sort of taciturn, mostly because it didn't have vocal cords and was unable to speak. Plus, its temper wasn't that great. How about shameless? No? What about shady? Also no? What about something simpler like what? Well, do you have suggestions then? All right. We'll shelve this conversation for later. By the time he was done with this short monologue, the shadow had already reached the bottom of the cliff. The range of shadow control was not limitless, but it was just barely enough to explore their nearest surroundings. Entering the labyrinth, Sunny found it to be extremely disorienting and convoluted. The paths between coral pillars were sometimes broad, sometimes narrow. They twisted and turned without any logic, often leading to dead ends or even back to where he started. More than that, some paths entered inside the coral mounds, turning into dark tunnels. The labyrinth was vast and multi-layered, making Sunny's head hurt after multiple fruitless attempts to memorize the layout of the nearest pathways. In the end, he sent the shadow up, forcing it to climb on top of the crimson forest and start jumping from one sharp coral blade to another, knowing full well that he himself would not be able to do the same. Soon, he circled the strange cliff and froze, scared by the sight of what was happening in its shadow. There, the corpse of the giant shark-like creature that had briefly pursued him the previous night was laying on the ground, the pillars of coral around it shattered and broken. More precisely, half of it was there, with grotesque innards spilling out of the terrible wound and stretching far away into the distance. The other half was gone, as though it had never existed. Around the corpse, hundreds of smaller monsters were scurrying, tearing away and devouring its flesh bit by bit. Each of them was about 2.5 meters tall, looking like a weird mix of a demonic crab, a centaur, and a nightmare. They had 4 pairs of long, segmented legs that ended in scythe-like protrusions. At the front, a human-like torso was protruding from the carapace, also clad in thick chitinous armor. The head, if it was even the appropriate word, was situated directly on top of the torso, with no neck in between. It had 2 narrow eye slits and a viscous-looking mouth with several slimy mandibles. Instead of hands, the monsters had 2 enormous pincers. Currently, they were all using those pincers to tear off chunks of meat off the desiccated corpse and stuff them into their mouths. From time to time, a fight for an especially juicy piece of meat would break out, ending up in a few monsters being torn apart and quickly devoured by the victors. Sonny swallowed. Both because the sight of heavily armored, powerful monsters made him nervous and because looking at them feasting, he suddenly felt very hungry. Each of them seems like trouble. And there are hundreds of them. His luck, like always, was awful. At least I don't have to wonder why the labyrinth feels so empty. All the inhabitants are having a party. Feeling a little bit comprehensive about turning his shadows back to the monsters, Sonny commanded it to look back and study the cliff he was taking shelter atop of. Something about it was making him feel uneasy. The shadow turned around and looked up, taking in the sight of the strangely shaped cliff. It took Sonny a few minutes to shift his perspective and recognize it for what it was. That's a finger. That's a hand. That is, a sword? He blinked. It's a statue. Indeed, the cliff was man-made. It was an ancient, colossal statue at least 200 meters tall. The scale of it was so massive that it boggled the mind. From what Sonny could see, it depicted a knight clad in an elaborate plate armor, with 7 shining stars carved into his breastplate. In his hands he was holding a gargantuan sword, pointing it to the ground. However, the most striking thing about it was that the giant stone knight was missing his head. In fact, the roughly circular platform Sonny was standing on turned out to be the top of his neck. And by the looks of it, the head wasn't missing by design. It was as though something, or someone, had violently tore it off at some point in the distant past. Sonny walked around the platform, looking down from all sides, but didn't notice the head lying anywhere near. What on earth is this place? Without any hints to find the answer, he led his shadow back to the giant's neck and settled at the western edge of it, studying the feasting monsters. He didn't move until the sun was about to set. Just as Sonny expected, as soon as the sun touched the horizon, a deafening rumble could be heard coming from somewhere below. The monsters instantly stopped their feast and scurried away, some hiding inside the coral pillars, some simply burying themselves in the soft soil. A few minutes later, the first streams of black water appeared in the labyrinth. Their volume quickly grew, and soon an apocalyptic flood devoured everything around. The sea was returning with the approach of the night. Sonny stared at this unimaginable process, thoughts churning in his head. In an hour, the circular platform was the only thing above the dark waters once again. Chapter 32. With an empty stomach and a head full of thoughts, Sonny returned to the center of the platform and sat down. After a while, he beckoned to his shadow and said, "Wake me up if anything happens." Then, he closed his eyes and tried to fall asleep. His consciousness quickly slid into the sweet embrace of darkness, giving Sonny some well-needed rest. In the middle of the night, however, a sudden impulse stirred him awake. Sonny jumped to his feet, his groggy mind full of tense apprehension. He was afraid that the owner of the giant tentacle had come back to finish the job. Or maybe some other horror from the depths had sensed him and decided to snack on human meat. However, the sea was quiet and calm. He didn't hear any abnormalities around the night statue. "What is it?" Sonny whispered, addressing the shadow. The shadow silently pointed him in a particular direction. Turning his head, Sonny squinted. He quickly understood why it was a good idea to wake up. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to see. Out there in the distance, a few kilometers away, a small orange light was shimmering in the darkness. Its reflections were rising and falling with the movement of waves. It was too far away to make out any details, so Sonny just stared at it for a while. Pretty soon, the light disappeared. Other sleepers? Natural phenomenon? Or some monster laying a trap? Memories of nightmarish deep-water creatures immediately came to his mind. Shaking his head, Sonny lay back down and attempted to return to his slumber. However, this time sleep was escaping him. Pangs of hunger were still not unbearable, but slowly becoming more and more intense. The thirst, however, was worse. In the end, he remained awake up until the sun rose again, sending the dark sea in retreat. As soon as the morning came, the pincer monsters crawled back from their hiding spots and rushed to the giant carcass to continue their feast. Sonny watched them for some time and then walked to the opposite side of the platform to take a look in the direction where he had seen the mysterious light the previous night. At a considerable distance from the headless statue, 5 or 6 kilometers away, the ground rose naturally and formed something akin to a hill. On top of that hill, an especially massive coral pillar rose to the sky. From the looks of it, its upper branches were just high enough to stay above water in the night. Various ideas stormed into Sonny's head, but at the end of it, only 2 questions were really important. First of all, would he be able to find the way through the labyrinth, and cover that distance during the day? And more importantly, should he even attempt to do it? After all, there was no indication that the source of the mysterious light was something beneficial, as opposed to dreadful and deadly. Not having enough information to make a choice, Sonny settled back to study the monsters. He did, however, send the shadow to investigate as far into the labyrinth as the range of shadow control allowed, hoping to chart at least the beginning of the path that could potentially lead him to that hill. Logically speaking, he was as safe atop the headless statue as he probably could be in this strange place. The only problem was, he was going to die soon because of thirst or hunger. Both problems were solvable if he were to venture down. He could desalinate the seawater in a number of ways taught to him by teacher Julius, with materials that were present pretty much everywhere in the dream realm. He could also prepare traps and hunt a pincer monster to eat. With their massive size, just one of them would be enough to feed him for weeks. He could easily see such a routine, hunting by day, returning to the statue at the approach of the night. It was probably his safest choice. However, this way of doing things lacked one vital element, the potential for improvement. It was well suited for keeping Sonny alive, but had no way of giving him hope. If he was destined to spend the rest of his life in the small area surrounding the headless statue, devouring monsters and trembling at night in fear of being devoured by something bigger in turn, well, he would rather just jump down and end it right now. That pretty much meant that the only choice left for him was to try and reach the source of the orange light. And if Sonny was really trying to attempt it, he had to do it before the pincer monsters were done consuming the giant carcass. That way, at least, the surrounding segment of the labyrinth was going to be free of them. Firm in his choice, Sonny decided to leave the headless statue the next morning. He would spend the rest of today exploring paths through the labyrinth and preparing himself mentally. With that, he closed his eyes and concentrated his perception on the moving shadow. In the night, a sudden storm descended upon the dark sea. Sonny was stirred awake by the shadow in time to prepare himself for the crushing winds and the pelting rain. Usually, rain always put him in a bad mood. But this time he was too thirsty to think about anything except for fresh water. Staying low so as to not be blown over the edge of the platform, Sonny cupped his hands and waited until they became filled with rainwater. Then he raised them to his mouth and greedily drank. Strikes of lightning illuminated everything above the churning sea. If anyone were to see Sonny now, they would have noticed a wide grin on his face. The storm continued to rampage for several hours. Sonny crouched in the middle of the platform, enduring its rage. More than once, a tall wave would crash into the headless knight's neck, threatening to wash him away. But Sunny held tight to the deep grooves in the stone surface of the platform, sticking to it like glue. By morning, when the storm finally dissipated, all of his muscles were sore. But there was no time to waste. As soon as the monsters came back to the carcass, with a few stragglers quickly following behind, he slid over the edge of the platform and began to nimbly climb down. Sunny had to thank wilderness survival classes once again, since he had been taught the basics of rock climbing as well. Teacher Julius was adamant about giving his student a crash course in all possible forms of traversal. Additionally, Sunny had already scouted the optimal way down and memorized the best holds and indentions to grab onto with the help of his shadow. Soon, his feet finally touched the ground. Despite the fact that leaving the safety of the headless statue was going to put him in considerable danger, Sunny instantly felt his mood improving. Remaining passive for the last couple of days did not suit his character well. Now, even if his plan were to end in failure, at least he was going to go down doing something that he had decided to do. Trying and failing was better than not trying at all. The black mud was deep enough to slow him down, but not to the extent he had been afraid of. With some practice, Sunny was soon able to walk at an acceptable speed. What's more, as long as he stuck to the shadows, his steps were light and silent, producing no squelching noises from the mud. He headed for one of the paths that were supposed to lead him to the distant hill and entered the cool shade of the crimson labyrinth. Immediately, a strange feeling enveloped his mind. It was as though the world beyond the labyrinth did not exist anymore, and all that was left were its twisting, dark paths. This thing almost seems endless. Shaking his head, Sunny sent the shadow to scout ahead, hoping to be notified of any latent danger in advance, and began to move forward. His life now depended on whether or not he would reach the distant hill before the sun began to set. He didn't even want to think about what would happen if he were still inside the labyrinth once the dark sea came back in an unstoppable flood. The shadow moved ahead of him, not meeting any hurdles. Sometimes it would climb high to scout the direction of different paths, allowing Sunny to choose the optimal route most of the time. However, he still had to backtrack a considerable distance once or twice, ending up either in a dead end or on a path leading in the wrong direction. Despite that, everything seemed to be going smoothly. Sunny even had time to carefully study the interior of the labyrinth, noticing more details of its composition, as well as a frightening amount of unrecognizable bones hiding in the mud beneath his feet. Because of how well things were going, he lowered his guard a little. His arrogance was also to blame. With his extensive preparations and skillful control of the Shadow Scout, Sunny subconsciously patted himself on the shoulder and assumed that everything was going to be fine. That's why, when the mud directly in front of him started to move, he was a fraction of a second late to react. In the next moment, a massive pincer shot out of the ground and tore through the air, threatening to cut his body in half with one crushing strike. Chapter 33. Crap! This was the only thought in Sunny's head as he awkwardly fell backward, allowing the pincer to close right in front of his face with a loud clack. The jagged, chitinous blades were so close that he could clearly see bits of mud sticking to their surface. Sunny landed on his back, narrowly avoiding the unexpected strike. The good thing was that he managed to avoid being injured or even killed. The bad thing was that he was sprawled on the ground, unable to quickly create distance between him and the attacker. The massive pincer was still hovering above. Just as this realization dawned on Sunny, he desperately rolled to the side. In the next moment, the pincer lunged down, sending small tremors through the mud. If not for his quick reaction, Sunny's chest would have been caved in by that blow. He was just beginning to stand up when the pincer swiped sideways. Luckily, Sunny was ready. Instead of trying to dodge or block the attack, he went with it, letting the pincer collide with his outstretched hands and cushioning the blow. As his arms screamed in pain, Sunny used the force of the blow and allowed his body to be sent flying through the air. This way, at least, he would get out of the pincer's range. He might not have been taught how to fight, but one thing he knew very well was how to fall. Instead of breaking his neck or having the breath beaten out of him by the landing, he braced his body and nimbly rolled before stopping some distance away from the ambushing monster. I take it back. Sonny, though, remembering his sarcastic critique of heroes' battle roles. Rolling is an integral part of any respectable monster fighting technique. Then, he looked up, trying to ascertain the situation. In front of him, the attacker had finally shown itself. It burrowed from under the mud, casting a vast shadow over kneeling Sonny. Its tiny eyes were full of rage, hunger, and malice. It was one of the pincer monsters he had spent so much time observing. Towering over him at almost 3 meters in height, the bulky creature moved its mandibles and produced a jarring, piercing screech. "Why aren't you devouring the giant carcass with the rest of your buddies, you crab bastard?" However, the answer to Sonny's indignant plea was rather obvious. The monster seemed to be in a rather bad shape. Half of its 8 scythe-like legs were broken, and there were cracks in its thick carapace, each oozing with viscous azure blood. Additionally, he was missing one of its 2 pincer arms, which seemed to have been torn off entirely at the shoulder. If not for this pathetic state, the creature would have had no need to hide in the mud, hoping to catch easy prey. It could have just followed the other monsters and joined on the feast. Sonny was just unlucky to stumble directly upon its ambush. He had relied too much on the scouting abilities of his shadow, forgetting that it wasn't much more observant than an awakened human. It was also weightless and inaudible. That's why the monster did not react when the shadow had passed over its trap a minute earlier. On the other hand, Sonny could also consider himself lucky. By the same logic, he would not have been able to dodge the creature's sudden attack if not for its crippled, slowed state. But pondering on his luck could wait for later. Right now, Sonny had a far more pressing thing to do. Namely, try to survive. "Get back here!" he ordered the shadow and jumped to the side. In the next second, the space he occupied a moment before was torn apart by the attacking monster. Its heavy pincer crashed into the side of a coral pillar, sending crimson shards flying in every direction. Sonny caught his balance and continued moving. He was hoping that the bulky, heavily armored, wounded creature would not be able to match his speed, but unfortunately it turned out to be surprisingly agile. Its scythe-like legs pierced the mud behind him, and the pincer was already flying through the air again, threatening to decapitate the young man at any second. Sonny ducked, dodging the pincer, and finally caught a second of reprieve. His eyes darted around, desperately searching for something to use as a weapon. Almost instantly, he noticed a long, smooth, sharp bone left behind by some unknown creature sticking from the mud. Without slowing down, he bent down and grabbed the bone, pulling it out with one forceful tug. The bone was almost 1.5 meters long, ending in a narrow, sharp tip. It was almost like a spear. The problem was, even with the added length of this makeshift spear, Sonny's range of attack was still shorter than the monster's. He also doubted that it was capable of piercing the hard carapace. In short, he had to get close and aim for one of the cracks in the creature's armor. However, he didn't dare to. At that short of a distance, the monster could easily crush him into a paste by using just its weight and hulking frame. A crazy idea entered Sonny's mind. A bit shocked, he momentarily couldn't decide whether it was the product of audacity or foolishness. Either way, he wasn't insane enough to actually consider it. At that moment, the pincer lashed out again. This time, Sonny was a little late to evade, and as a result, a sharp pain pierced his left leg. It was grazed by the edge of the pincer. The puppeteer's shroud held, not allowing the monster to draw blood, but the force of the impact was enough to throw Sonny tumbling to the ground. There was no time to recover. As his eyes opened wide, Sonny understood that it was time to act crazy. So, instead of trying to dodge, he stopped moving and allowed the monster to grab him across his torso with the pincer. Immediately, a terrible pressure descended on his ribs. Sonny felt as though he was going to be split apart, but his armor, received from defeating an awakened tyrant, resisted the crushing bite of the monster's pincer. Every muscle in his body tensed, delaying the moment when his insides would be turned into mush. In the next second, Sonny's shadow fell from above, wrapping itself around the puppeteer's shroud. With the protective properties of the armor enhanced, he was able to better resist the pincer's pulverizing embrace. Sonny and the monster appeared to be at an impasse. The young man couldn't free himself from the monster's grip, while the monster could not kill the prey by cutting it in halves with its pincer. They stared at each other. Then, an insane fire ignited in the creature's eyes. It clicked its mandibles and raised Sonny in the air, bringing him closer to its mouth, obviously intent on biting his head off. "Why is everyone trying to eat me? Am I that tasty?" Sonny didn't struggle as the monster brought him close to its mandibles. He knew he only had one chance to live. In the last moment, Sonny allowed the shadow to flow from Puppeteer's shroud onto the sharp bone he was still clenching in his hand. Then, he gathered all his strength, leaned forward and thrust the bone forward with as much power as he could. Guided by his hand, the dark bone spear shot forward and pierced through the creature's tiny eye, sinking in deep. The other eye of the monster narrowed. Gritting his teeth from the unbearable pain in his ribs, Sonny twisted the bone, trying to do as much damage to the creature's brain as possible. For a couple of seconds, nothing happened. Then, he felt the pressure on his body diminishing. The pincer opened, letting Sonny fall down. As he hit the mood, the hulking monster crashed to the ground, too. The bone spear was still sticking from its head, bathed in the streams of azure liquid. Sonny moaned and drew in a raspy, painful breath. "You have slain an awakened beast, carapace scavenger. You have received a memory, Azure Blade. Your shadow grows stronger." Chapter 34. Sonny was sprawled in the mud, trying to catch his breath. The subtle voice of the spell echoed in his ears. "Your shadow grows stronger." Immediately, he felt a slight change. His body grew a little bit stronger, his vision a little sharper, his skin a little smoother. The change was minimal, but apparent. What was that? He had a guess, and it was easy to confirm. Sonny summoned the runes. Shadow fragments, 14/1000. Previously, he only had 12 of the mysterious shadow fragments, with no knowledge on how to acquire more. Now it seemed that the process was automatic. He only had to kill an enemy to absorb a part of their shadow and enhance his own core. More than that, the number of fragments he was able to receive wasn't directly correlated to the number of slain enemies. After a bit of thinking, Sonny came to a preliminary conclusion. Dormant soul cores gave him 1 fragment, while awakened ones gave 2. However, only enemies he defeated directly, more or less, counted. Killing the Mountain King's larva, a dormant beast, had given him 1 shadow fragment. Finishing off the veteran slaver, a dormant human, another. Mountain King itself was an awakened tyrant, which meant that it had 5 awakened cores. With each giving Sonny 2 shadow fragments, he ended up with a total of 12. And now, after killing the carapace scavenger, he had 14. Interestingly, he didn't receive any fragments from the deaths of Shifty, Scholar and Hero, even though they perished as a result of his machinations. It seems he had to finish an enemy off with his own 2 hands to absorb a part of their shadow. Well, or at least by summoning an ancient dead god. The process was quite similar to how normal awakened increased their power, with the only difference being that the steps of extracting and consuming the corresponding material, soul shards, were skipped in favor of instant absorption. That meant that shadow fragments could not be stored, and subsequently could not be bought or traded. He won't have an opportunity to receive them as a reward for completing missions, providing services, or selling various spoils. If Sonny wanted to grow stronger, his only option was to fight and kill. No peaceful life for me, I guess. Previously, Sonny thought that he at least had the choice to choose a relatively safe path. Many awakened never left the confines of human citadels and never faced nightmare creatures, choosing instead to perform various jobs in the dream realm just as they would in the real world. They received payments in the form of soul shards, which were simultaneously the fuel of one's progression and the universal currency inside the citadels. Sonny was never set on pursuing such a life, but not even having a choice was sort of irritating. Luckily, there was a bright side too. Without the need to use soul shards to strengthen his core, he would be able to spend everything he earns freely and without concern. After all, after he kills an enemy and absorbs the shadow fragments, the soul shard would still be there, ready to be collected and exchanged for something Sonny might need in the future. That would effectively make him twice as efficient in terms of earning and spending, which was not a small advantage. Additionally, there was the matter of the shadow core. Since both Sunny and his shadow were tied to it, strengthening the core would not only increase Sunny's power, but also enhance the shadow. So if he were to use it to further empower himself, the actual effect would be stacked, producing a twofold enhancement. So, for each shadow fragment he collected, Sunny would actually be able to rip twice as much benefit as an awakened would from a soul shard. Not bad. Not bad at all. Ah, the future was bright. Provided he survives and gets the opportunity to even have a future, of course. Sitting up, Sunny moved his eyes and found the cluster of runes describing his memories. Azure Blade. Had he finally gotten a weapon? Memory, Azure Blade. Memory rank, Awakened. Memory type, Weapon. Memory description, on this forgotten shore, only steel remembers. Huh. Interesting. Not very informative, but interesting. Sunny summoned his new weapon, and a sharp, light sword immediately appeared in his hand. It was about a meter long, including the handle. The blade was straight and single-edged, ending in an angular tip. It was forged out of azure steel, with a beautiful layered pattern. Deep inside the steel, white sparks could be seen. The crossguard was minimalistic and simple, offering almost no protection to the wielder's hands. If Sunny knew his way around cold weapons, he would have called it a Tang Dao. However, he had no idea about such things. All he could gather was that the blade was single-edged, which meant that it was probably meant for slashing and cutting as opposed to piercing, and that the handle was long enough to accommodate two hands. Also, the sword was pretty. He summoned the shadow and made it wrap itself around the azure blade. Immediately, the steel became bluish-black, with a scattering of white sparks. It looked like a starlit night sky. Sunny stood up and waved the sword a couple of times, getting accustomed to its weight. The sharp edge whistled as it cut the air. Well, now I finally look like a real awakened. After that, he cast a gaze at the corpse of the carapace scavenger and grimaced. This part was not going to be pleasant. After some time, he managed to break open the cracked carapace and cut away a few strips of tender, pink meat. He also did not forget to extract the radiant crystal from the beast's chest, the soul shard. Without much hope, he tried to absorb the shard, remembering how it was supposed to be done. Just as he expected, nothing happened. They're really of no direct use to me. With a shrug, Sunny places the shard and the meat in a makeshift rucksack he weaved from black seaweed and looked at the sun. The day was still young. He still had a good chance of making it to the distant hill before the sea came back. However, his left leg was banged up in the fight with the scavenger beast, so walking wasn't as easy as it was before. He gritted his teeth and began limping. Hours passed. Due to his bruises and increased vigilance, Sunny's progress slowed down considerably. He was sweating and grinding his teeth, feeling pain with each step. What's worse, the further he reached into the labyrinth, the more confusing and entangled the paths became. Even with the shadow's help, he constantly had to backtrack and struggled to move in the right direction. Crap. If nothing changed, Sunny would not reach his goal. Which meant that he'll be crushed to death by the returning sea. Not allowing himself to think about dying, Sunny tried to walk faster. However, he couldn't be too hasty. Making a wrong turn would have taken precious minutes away from him, so he had to choose the way carefully. Additionally, missing to notice another ambush could end his life directly. Curses. Just when he was beginning to feel desperate, his shadow suddenly saw something that momentarily sent Sunny into a stupor. Some distance further down the path, beyond a few turns, the corals widened, creating a small clearing. And in the middle of that clearing, someone was walking across the mud. The first thing Sunny saw was fair skin, a lot of skin. The tall, lithe girl was only dressed in a makeshift skirt and a crude brassiere, both made out of seaweed. However, it didn't seem to bother her. With a calm expression, she stopped and looked back. The wind was playing with her short silver hair. It was Nephi's, the changing star. In one hand she was holding the end of a strange golden rope. And on the other end of the rope, Kasia, the blind girl, was carefully following behind. Chapter 35. Gray sky above, black mud below, an endless sea of crimson in between. On this dreamlike backdrop, two beautiful girls were walking across the labyrinth. One was delicate and fragile, with blonde hair and cerulean, aimless eyes. She was dressed in a simple tunic, with leather sandals on her feet and a cloak the color of sea waves draped around her shoulders. The other was tall and lithe. She had silky silver hair and clear, gray eyes. Her revealing clothes were crudely made out of black seaweed, leaving her fair skin and athletic build exposed. She was poised, alert, and barefoot. A golden rope connected two girls together. Wow! What a sight! Sunny thought. He suddenly regretted that he was not an artist. The picture just begged to be made into a painting. Wait, why am I thinking about that? People! I found people! His heart skipped a bit. If Nephi's and Kasia were here, then the orange light from before, most likely, had something to do with them. Which meant that they knew how to get to the tall hill. Which meant that Sunny didn't have to be crushed to death by the high tide. So what do I do now? He wasn't the best at ingratiating himself to other people. In fact, he was the polar opposite. People usually instinctively avoided him. And that was in normal circumstances. This time, however, he had spent a whole of 4 weeks making sure that everyone in the academy hated his guts. Good job, Sunny! Still, he was at least useful. In this situation, an additional body was already a great boon when facing hungry monsters. And he wasn't just anyone. His ability to scout ahead alone was worth a lot. Surely they'll understand that, right? With a heavy sigh, Sunny stepped into shadows and hurried to the clearing. He reached it in a minute or so, hiding and observing the two girls before making a final decision. Helping herself with the wooden staff, blind Kasia slowly approached the middle of the clearing and extended her hand, finding Nephi's and touching her on the shoulder. Why did you stop? Nephi's supported the blind girl and glanced at the sky. It's getting late. An awkward pause hung between two girls. After some time, Kasia asked, So you think we should turn back? Nephi's blinked and cleared her throat. Yes. Sunny was a bit amused by their exchange. What is she, a strong silent type? Then he returned to his dilemma and grimaced. How do I approach them? Damn, why is this so hard? It's not like I'm trying to ask them out on a date. I mean, one of them, both of them. What am I thinking about? Just go and say hi. But then, if he suddenly appeared out of the shadows, not at all like a creep, how high was the probability of them getting spooked and attacking him before noticing that he was not a monster? Wait, why would they? Arg, to hell with this. Deciding on the safest approach, Sunny commanded his shadow to abandon its hiding place and move to a spot where Nephi's could clearly see it. He could clearly sense the shadow rolling its eyes as it obeyed the order. As soon as the shadow started to move, Nephi's suddenly snapped her hands sideways. Immediately, a long sword appeared in it, cutting the air as it assumed a defensive position. Before the shadow could even take 2 steps out of its hiding spot, it was already pierced by Changing Star's gray eyes. The shadow froze. It seemed a bit startled. Kasia took a step back. Neph? What is it? Nephi's didn't answer immediately, carefully observing the shadow. Then she simply said, There's a shadow. Kasia's doll-like face paled. A shadow? Scavengers? The tall girl tilted her head a little. No. It's a human shadow. This was clearly not what Kasia expected to hear. With an expression of surprise, she asked, A human shadow? What is it doing? Nephi's hesitated. After a while, she answered in a flat tone. It's waving at us. After a whole minute of silence, Kasia finally found the words to react. What? I said, it's waving. Yes, I know. I mean, why is it doing that? Nephi's opened her mouth, then closed it again. I don't know. Maybe it's a distraction to lure us into a trap. At this point, Sunny decided that it was time to talk. He inhaled deeply, then said in a friendly tone, "Actually, I just sent it ahead to make sure that you don't stab me with that sword before realizing that I'm human." Immediately, Nephi's turned her head, pinpointing the exact location where Sunny was hiding in a blotch of shadows. Her sword slightly shifted, aiming at the new threat. "If you're human, why are hiding in the shadows like a creep?" "Goddamn, I'm not a creep," Sunny hoped. But his flaw was merciless. He had to provide an answer, and a truthful one at that. "I mean, you're changing star Nephi's. To be honest, I'm a little afraid." Nephi's did not answer. Because of her hard-to-read face, it was almost impossible to determine whether she believed him or not. However, he included her true name in his answer for a reason. If he was some monster pretending to be human, he wouldn't have known it. Luckily, Kasha was more expressive. "Are you the boy who sat with me in the cafeteria?" Sunny smiled. Meanwhile, Nephi's glanced at the blind girl. "Do you know him?" Kasha nodded. "I recognize his voice. His name is Sunless. He was in second to last place in the rankings, right above me." The tall girl frowned, as if trying to remember. Then she asked, "The pervert?" The smile disappeared from Sunny's face, replaced by exasperation. "Oh, come on." Kasha hesitated and didn't answer. "Hey! I'm not really a pervert, you know. I just, said a few things. To a few girls. It was all a misunderstanding." Nephi's was silent for a few seconds, and then, finally, dismissed her sword. "Okay. You can come out." Sunny limped out of the shadows, summoning his own back. It flowed to his feet and reattached itself, visibly shaking. The bastard was laughing at him. Stopping a few meters away from Nephi's, he raised his hands, showing that he didn't mean the girls any harm. Changing Star gave him an inquisitive look. "What happened to you?" She was referring to his limp, bruises, and overall banged-up look. Sunny sighed. "Carapace scavenger." Nephi's raised an eyebrow. "You managed to get away alive?" "You bet I did." Sunny subconsciously straightened his back. "I didn't get away. I killed it." To prove his point, he gestured at his rucksack, full of delicious monster meat. Nephi's looked him over again, reevaluating her opinion of him. Now, there were hints of approval in her eyes. Carapace scavengers were only beasts, but they were still awakened. With the addition of their mighty physique and natural armor, defeating one was not an easy feat for any sleeper, who all had a dormant core. Let alone someone from the very bottom of the ranking list. Come to think of it, it was even a bit too outstanding. Sunny lowered his eyes. It was already wounded." Nephi shrugged. "A kill is a kill. You did well." After that, she fell silent, as though not planning to say anything else. Sunny also wasn't sure what to say. Luckily, Kasha came to the rescue. "Are you seriously injured?" He shook his head. "No, it's just that my ribs and leg are bruised. I'll be fine in a day or two. My armor is pretty resilient." He wasn't worried that they might be tempted to kill him to get the puppeteer's shroud. That was because memories were destroyed at the moment of their owner's death. So they only could be transferred voluntarily by a living person. Well, there was always torture and blackmail. But he doubted that any one of the two beautiful girls would stoop to that. Sunny cleared his throat. "Before stumbling on the scavenger, I was heading for the tall hill with the massive coral pillar on top. But after the fight, my speed decreased. Now I'm worried about not making it in time. Do you perhaps know the way?" Kasha smiled. "Actually, we spent the last days on that hill. We were just about to go back." Nephi's didn't say anything, looking at the sky. Sunny licked his lips. "Well, can I come with you?" "They're not going to say no, right?" The blind girl turned her head to her companion, a clear question written on her face. "Neph?" Nephi's lowered her eyes, staring at Sunny. After a while she said, "No." "What?" "Problem." "No problem. What's wrong with you, princess? Can't you speak faster?" Feeling his heart beating wildly in his chest, Sunny smiled. "Well, all right. Chapter 36. The rest of the way to the tall hill did not take a lot of time. With Nephi's leading the way, taking all the right turns at all the right places, there was no need to explore the labyrinth and backtrack after encountering a dead end. Additionally, there were no scavengers around. In fact, they could have moved ever quicker if not for Kasha, who walked slowly even with the help of her staff. Guided by the golden rope, she carefully explored the ground ahead before taking each step. The uneven paths of the Crimson Forest were not an ideal surface for a blind person to walk on. Sunny didn't say much, periodically casting an incredulous glance at the strange pair. No matter how he looked at it, Kasha seemed to be dead weight. Perhaps it was cruel to say, but in the merciless reality of the dream realm, misguided kindness was a sure way to end up dead. Before meeting and observing the girls, he still had hoped that Kasha's terrible flaw hid an unexpected and powerful aspect. But from what he saw, it wasn't the case. If she couldn't even walk properly, what kind of power was there to hide? Nothing could outweigh the ruthless fact that the blind girl couldn't protect herself, and thus would only drag her companions down. One had to be a fool or not fond of living to allow that to happen. So, which one of these descriptions suited Nephi's? Somehow, he felt that neither did. The sunset was not far off when they reached the hill. After climbing it, and approaching the massive growth of coral, Nephi's dismissed the golden rope and immediately summoned it again. This way, it was untied and appeared in her hands in a neat bundle. Ah. So it's a memory. Sunny wondered what qualities the magical rope had. Soon, his curiosity was satisfied. Right in front of his surprised eyes, the length of the rope suddenly began to increase. Soon, it was thrice as long as it was before. Nephi's calmly tied both ends of the rope into loops, and then threw one of them into the air, accurately coiling it around a prominent protrusion near the top of the coral pillar. Then she tested if the rope would hold, swiftly climbed up and waved from above, giving Sunny the signal to follow. After hesitating for a second, Sunny approached the rope and grabbed it. He couldn't help thinking that this would be the perfect opportunity to cut his head off. With him helpless while climbing and Nephi standing on the top of the pillar, the vivid picture appeared in his mind. Stop being paranoid, Sunny thought, trying to calm himself down. It's not that he was sure of Changing Star's impeccable moral qualities. Instead, he was certain of one thing: if Nephi's really wanted to kill him, she wouldn't have needed to wait for an opportunity. She could have just cut him into ribbons whenever. Simultaneously scared and reassured by this though, Sunny nimbly climbed up and joined Nephi's at the top of the coral mound. He then turned around and watched curiously, wondering how Kasha was going to get to them. The blind girl dismissed the wooden staff and approached the rope. Then she caught it in a hand, traced it down to the loop at the end, and placed her foot inside. As soon as she was done, Nephi's grabbed the rope and started pulling, lifting Kasha little by little until she had reached the top. She only had to grab Nephi's hand and make a step to join them. Efficient. The coral mound was much larger than the circular stone platform of the giant knight's neck. In fact, it was almost like a small island. At the highest point of the island, hidden behind some coral blades, the girls had made a little camp. There were piles of seaweed to sleep on, strips of scavenger meat drying under the sun, and a fire pit. Sunny pointed to the makeshift fire pit. Was it you 2 nights ago? I've seen an orange light in the distance. Kasha's face darkened. Yes, this was the first time we made a fire. But it turned out to be a really bad mistake. Nephi sighed. Sunny raised an eyebrow, surprised. Why? The blind girl touched her hair and turned her head to Nephi's. At night, any light will attract monsters. We were attacked by scavengers first. And then... She paled and didn't finish. But she didn't have to. The memory of the colossal tentacle was still fresh in Sunny's mind. It seemed that he was lucky to meet these two when he had. If not, he was certainly going to make a fire tonight to roast some scavenger meat. I see. Nephi's looked at the sky and cleared her throat. It should be fine now. We still have time before the sun sets. After that, she got busy making the fire. Cassius simply sat on a pile of seaweed and waited. Not knowing what to do, Sonny lowered himself to the ground and let his tired, bruised body rest. After a while he said, "I have fresh meat in my rucksack. Do you have water?" Cassius smiled. "Yes." After that, she extended an arm to him. A second later, a beautiful bottle made of patterned blue glass appeared in her hand. "That's a memory I have. It's always full." Sonny took the glass bottle and looked at it with envy. "An endless supply of water, huh? Sure beats my super loud bell." "Thank you." He brought the bottle to his lips and greedily drank the cool, delicious water. Indeed, no matter how much he drank, the amount of water inside did not seem to decrease. "Is it really endless?" Kasia touched her hair again. Not really. If you turn it upside down and let the water flow, it will stop in half an hour or so. But then it will be full again pretty soon." At that time, Nephi's was already done making the fire. Without looking up, she took Sonny's rucksack and opened it. Immediately, the soul shard rolled out. The tall girl looked at it, then at Sonny. Then she put the shard back in and pulled out the meat. Sonny became tense, preparing a misleading answer. But Nephi's did not ask. So, he pretended like nothing had happened and continued his conversation with Kasia. "It's still a great memory. Getting drinkable water is not an easy task." Kasia nodded and smiled, pleased by his words. Soon, the rich smell of roasting meat permeated the air. At the same time, the sun was beginning to approach the horizon. A loud rumble came from somewhere beneath, and first traces of the black water began to appear between crimson walls of the labyrinth. Sonny looked east, where the skies were already growing dark. Then he uncomfortably shifted. "Do scavengers come all the way up here?" Nephi's turned the meat and nodded. "Yes. But only at night. In the day, most of them seem to disappear." Sonny grinned, having an idea of why there weren't a lot of monsters in the labyrinth in the day. "That's because they all gather near the place I had been spending my time recently. You should have seen it, the tall cliff to the west of here. Well, it's actually a statue." Kasia opened her eyes wide. A statue? But for you to survive, it should be." "Yes, it's a giant statue of a knight, at least 200 meters tall. He is missing his head, so I hid on top of the neck. Anyway, the day we were sent here, 2 sea creatures fought each other near that statue. When the water receded, I saw an enormous carcass lying there, with hundreds of scavengers slowly tearing it apart." Nephi's nodded. "That would explain the lack of nightmare creature in the day." "How long?" Sonny blinked. "How long what?" Changing Star stared at him for a few seconds, making everyone feel uncomfortable. "How long, until they are done devouring the carcass?" "Oh. 1 day more, 2 at most." Nephi's turned away, took the meat away from the fire, and then quickly extinguished it. "There's definitely something wrong with that girl." The 3 of them ate in the dimming light of the twilight. The meat was juicy, tender and indescribably delicious. It was better than anything Sonny had ever tasted, even back in the Academy's cafeteria. Of course, his excruciating hunger played a part in that. From time to time, they would pass the glass bottle to each other. When they were finished with their meal, the dark sea was back, and the night was upon them. Everything was consumed by absolute darkness. Of course, Sonny could easily see both Nephi's and Kasia. Under the cover of the night, Changing Star remained pretty much the same. The blind girl, however, allowed her true emotions to show, thinking that no one would see. She seemed much more lost, lonely and frightened than she did in the day. As if trying to resist these feelings, Kasia said in a bright voice, "How about we formally introduce ourselves? I'm Cassie." Nephi's glanced in her direction and shrugged. "Neph." Next, it was Sonny's turn. He exhaled, glad that they didn't ask his name directly. Most likely, he would still have been able to provide his human name, however, it also might have depended on the wording of the question. Relieved, he smiled and answered, "I'm Sunless. But you can call me Sonny." Chapter 37. Sunny was slowly growing fond of having conversations in the dark. Without the burden of light, people were more relaxed and honest. It reminded him of the frequent blackouts that used to sweep through the city when he was a little kid. His family had no choice but to huddle together and spend a few hours doing nothing but talking to each other. Now, these dark hours had become some of his most precious memories. He was silent for a few moments and then said, "Since we're going to be depending on each other, should we share what abilities and memories we have at our disposal?" This was a logical suggestion. If they were going to fight side by side, knowing each other's strengths was more or less vital. Still, he noticed Nephi's glancing in his direction with a guarded look on her face. Luckily, he was obscured by darkness. "I'll start," Sunny said, both to show his sincerity and to reveal information about himself in a controlled manner. If he took the initiative to talk, he still had to tell the truth, but how much and to what extent was still for him to decide. If they were to ask and he had to answer, however, things would become unpredictable. "My attributes give me an affinity to shadows. I also have a slight affiliation to divinity. Lastly, I am prone to finding myself in unlikely situations." Cassie listened carefully, and then lowered her head, as though embarrassed. He is telling the truth. Not that we doubted your honesty." "Why not? I spent so much time earning the reputation of a pathological liar." Sunny cleared his throat and smiled, hiding his nervousness. "Really? That's good to know. But why are you so sure that I am being honest?" The blind girl shifted a little. "Oh, that's my ability. I can see people's attributes. Sometimes I also receive, visions. They can be about the future or the past. I mean, that's what I think. It only happened a couple of times." Sunny swallowed, but then relaxed. "So, she is an oracle of sorts. Luckily, her insight is limited to attributes, otherwise, I'd be in real trouble. Still, I'll have to be careful around her." He finally realized how the blind girl had known about his birthday. The question was whether she had seen it in a vision of the future or in a vision of the past. If it was the former, was it safe to assume that he would certainly be able to celebrate at least one more birthday? Or did knowing the future actually affected and changed it? For example, after learning that he was definitely going to survive, Sunny might have naturally relaxed and lowered his guard. Then, he would die as the result of it. It surely seemed possible, right? That's assuming that the future could be changed. But maybe it wasn't? Then, feeling his head hurting, Sunny decided to avoid this line of thought for now. Instead, he hid his inner turmoil and said in a friendly tone, "That's a good ability. Speaking of abilities, you have already seen mine. My shadow can move independently and explore. It can't affect the material world, but we share sight and hearing. That way, I can spot danger before encountering it. The shadow is fast and stealthy. It can go anywhere and is almost impossible to notice. Oh, I can also see in the dark." He smiled, expecting the girls to understand and appreciate the utility of his shadow scout. Their reaction, however, was a bit strange. Nephi slowly turned her head in his direction, while Cassie became a bit pale and raised her hands to cover her chest. What?" Nephi frowned and said in a flat tone. "Have you ever used your ability in the academy?" Sunny blinked. What a strange question. "In the academy?" "Sure, of course." "Why?" "Oh, right, they think that I'm a pervert." "Crap." Before the girls could say anything, he hurriedly raised his hand and blurted, "But I have never used it to do anything improper. You have to believe me." Fortunately, it was the honest truth. However, both Nephi's and Cassie looked skeptical. Sunny gritted his teeth. "I had more important things to do than whatever you're thinking about. I spent almost every waking hour learning how to survive." Nephi's raised an eyebrow. "I haven't seen you in class, even once." Sunny chuckled. "Of course you didn't. While you were busy wiping the floor with other sleepers, I was studying wilderness survival." It was Changing Star's turn to blink. "Wilderness, what? There is such a course?" Cassie seemed equally puzzled. Yes, there is. It might seem like an afterthought for most people, but for an outskirts kid like me, who never went to a fancy school or saw a private tutor, learning how to survive in the wilderness is the difference between life and death. Without it, I would have drowned the moment we were sent to the dream realm. On a rare occasion, Nephi's looked completely bewildered. She rubbed her wrists and stared thoughtfully in his direction. I see. I didn't know. Sonny grimaced and struggled to keep the venom from sipping into his voice. When he finally spoke, his tone was light and amiable. That's okay. It's natural for someone of your status not to know. When he mentioned her status, a strange smile appeared on the changing star's face. But in the end, she didn't reply. Sonny continued. Anyway, that's my ability. As for memories, I have 3. One is an armor, one is a sword, and the last one is a really loud bell. Now it was their turn to share. After a short pause, Nephi spoke. My attributes give me an affinity to light and fire, as well as a strong affiliation to divinity. I have 2 memories, a rope. While she was speaking, Sonny was looking at Cassie, trying to read her expression. From what he saw, Nephi's was telling the truth, but also not the whole truth. And judging by how hard the blind girl was trying to hide her true feelings, the secret hiding among changing stars' attributes was not at all trivial. Interesting. And the sword. The rope is very sturdy and can change its length. The sword is very sharp and can protect its wielder against soul's attacks, to a certain extent. My ability can be used to heal. Sonny didn't miss the wording of the last part. Can be used to heal. Does this mean that its main purpose was something else? He was pretty sure that Nephi's would not reveal all of her cards, just like him. However, healing abilities were extremely rare. Having one that could heal, but was not limited to healing, that would be simply unheard of. But then again, she was Changing Star, one of the few people in history to receive a true name in the first nightmare. If Sonny were to consider his own aspect ability, nothing seemed impossible. I wonder what's her aspect rank is. Outwardly, he pretended to be excited. You're a healer? That's great. Having a healer among us is incredible luck. Cassie nodded and smiled. Neph is also an amazing fighter. You should have seen her dealing with those scavengers. Well, I also did not actually see it. But it sounded very scary. Sonny didn't need anyone to tell him how formidable of a warrior Nephi's was. He had seen it with his own 2 eyes. Sort of. Actually, they were his shadow's eyes. Well, whatever it had instead of eyes. Meanwhile, Cassie sighed. It's my turn? My attributes are nothing special. I guess I have an affinity to revelations and fate. My ability is like I told you before. It's not very useful. About my memories, I have 3, the bottle, the wooden staff and this armor. You already know about the bottle. The staff can create wind. The armor is actually of the awakened rank. Neph gave it to me when we met. It has a very powerful protective charm. So, she's not only carrying Cassie on her back, she even gave away her only clothes? An awakened rank armor, at that? What is Nephi's thinking about? The blind girl turned away and added after a while. I used to be a pretty decent fencer, before. Now I can't really fight. The last 2 sentences were obviously related to her flaw. Sonny and Nephi's, however, both chose to keep their secret. Despite the fact that knowing your companion's flaw was also important for cooperation and having each other's backs, sharing something like that demanded a very high level of trust. Right now, there was no trust between them. And even if there was, Sonny did not plan to ever share his flaw with anyone. Nephi's, too, seemed to have a lot of secrets. After a while he said, Good. That's good. I think we have enough tools to survive, provided we use them right. I guess it's time to sleep? In the darkness, Nephi's tilted her head, listening to his words with a distant look. All right. I'll take watch first. Sonny decided to be helpful and said, Actually, my shadow doesn't sleep. It can wake us up if something happens. Changing Star slowly smiled. I'll take watch first. Feeling a bit of coldness in her voice, Sunny sighed and shrugged. Suit yourself? What are you going to watch, huh? You can't even see anything. Whatever. Just don't blame me when something giant swallows us in the middle of the night. Then he suddenly shuddered. Wait, that was not a death flag, right? Right, of course not. No way. Chapter 38. Sleep was avoiding Sunny. For a while, he sat silently in the darkness, listening to the calming rumbling of the waves. In this rare moment of respite, memories of the past few days came flooding into his mind. However, he was too tired to seriously think about anything. He was warm, full, and relatively safe. For now, that was more than enough. Soon, the rhythm of Cash's breathing changed, indicating that she fell asleep. Nephi's was guarding the camp, motionless and, as always, a bit distant. With her silver hair and fair skin, she looked like an alabaster statue. Sunny sighed. He struggled for a bit, and then said quietly, Hey! Can I ask you a question? Nephi's glanced at him and shrugged. The lack of an audible response clearly indicated that she remembered about his ability to see in the dark. Sure. Would it be too personal? Sunny hesitated. I thought you legacies come into the spell with a whole inherited arsenal of memories. I mean, that's supposed to be your main advantage. How come you only had 3? Nephi's was silent for a few moments. Actually, I only had 2. The rope came from Cassie. He raised an eyebrow. Oh. I see. Realizing that her answer wasn't really an answer, Nephi's thought for a while and added. We lost most of our memories when my father passed away. The ones that remained were sold one by one over the years, to keep the family afloat. This sword and armor came from my first nightmare. So that's how it was. Sunny realized that the fall of the Immortal Flame clan might have been more thorough than he had thought. Still, something about it didn't make sense. Surely, with your clan's reputation and standing, there were other ways to make money. Without any strong reaction, Nephi simply said, There were other reasons. Then, she unexpectedly turned her head in his direction. Can I ask you a question in return? Sunny swallowed. Yeah, go ahead. Nephi's tilted her head. How did you know that I'm a legacy? What? That's it. Simple. I heard Castor mention it. He was scolding other sleepers to make them treat you with respect. She gave him a nod and turned away. What thoughts were hidden behind her calm gray eyes, Sunny did not know. Some time had passed before he gathered enough courage to ask the question that he really wanted to ask. Before doing it, though, he made sure that Cassie was sound asleep and lowered his voice. Can I ask another question? Without getting a negative response, he continued. Why are you burdening yourself with her? A corner of Changing Star's mouth curled up slightly. Why? Wouldn't you? Sunny gritted his teeth, feeling the flaw pushing the truthful answer out of his mouth. No. To be honest, he wanted to believe to the last moment that the answer would be yes. But one of the things he had lost after the nightmare was the ability to lie to himself. Truth was merciless. It's not that Sunny did not pity the blind girl or didn't want to help her. It's just that he knew with certainty that it was simply not something he could do. He was barely able to save himself, let alone carry a helpless person across the dream realm. If he tried, they would just die together. Still, he couldn't help but be a little disappointed in himself. Nephi's, however, did not seem to judge him. She showed no reaction at all. After a few moments, she simply said, Because I want to. Because she wants to? That was not the response Sunny expected to hear. He was pretty sure that she would either lecture him about virtue and compassion or disclose some obscure way to make Cassie's seemingly weak ability incredibly useful. However, she did neither. Nephi's expected him to believe that she was putting her life in danger, to the point of sacrificing an awakened armor-type memory, because that was something she simply wanted to do. Ridiculous. At first, he dismissed her response as a non-answer. But the more he thought about it, the more disturbed he felt. Because, maybe, it was actually the truth. Due to the circumstances of his life, Sonny had never really done things because he wanted to. Most of the time, he was doing them because he needed to. It was never a question of want, it was always a question of must. For him, this was a basic rule of life. But was it really? Or was it just a matter of perspective? Nephi's had certain advantages in her upbringing, but they weren't as ample as he had imagined. She had no wealth and no arsenal of relics to empower her. However, she did have a mentality that was different from Sonny's. It wasn't impossible for her to have the audacity to disregard need in favor of something as frivolous as desire, and do things that a normal person like Sonny would never do. Like helping a blind girl simply because that was what Nephi's wanted to do. Perhaps, that mentality was the greatest advantage of all. Perhaps, that was the real barrier that separated legacies from the rest of them. That was a lot to think about. However, before Sonny could gather his thoughts, Nephi suddenly spoke again. My turn. Does she mean it's her turn to ask a question? Indeed, that was what she meant. Changing Star once again turned to Sonny and, after a long pause, suddenly asked, Do you know the legend of Odysseus? A what? Who? What sort of a weird question is that? Bewildered, Sonny shook his head. Then, remembering that she couldn't see him, he said, No. Nephi sighed and turned away. A few moments later she softly said, Odysseus was a hero in an ancient war. In the legends, some humans back then had powers akin to the awakened. Achilles with an aspect of indestructible body, Diomedes that was so ferocious even the god of war was wary of him, Ajax who was as strong as a giant. Odysseus was not the strongest, and not the bravest. However, he was the most cunning. Sonny blinked, staring at the silver-haired girl. What? Where did this come from? Why is she suddenly so eloquent? Meanwhile, Nephi's continued. In the end, Odysseus's cunning ended the war, and he prepared to sail home. However, the gods cursed him to endlessly wander the seas, never to return. Over the years, he survived one horror after another and lost all of his companions. Then, shipwrecked, he found himself on an island where the beautiful fairy, Calypso, lived. Changing Star's ethereal, strangely wistful voice resounded in the darkness, creating an enthralling atmosphere. Sonny couldn't help but listen with the utmost attention. Calypso fell in love with Odysseus and invited him to her palace. For many years, they lived together in harmony. The island was like a paradise, filled with all kinds of wonders, delicacies, and delights. As long as loving Calypso was by his side, Odysseus was even immortal. But the longer he stayed, the more time he spent sitting on the shore, looking at the sea with bleak eyes. Nephi smiled. In the end, Odysseus built a makeshift boat and abandoned the island, leaving all its delights, the beautiful fairy, and even his immortality behind. So, my question is, why did he leave? Sonny blinked. What? What kind of a mind game was that? He even considered that Nephi's was mocking him, but it didn't seem to be the case. It looked like she was sincerely interested in the answer. Weirdo. He thought for a bit, and then said without too much conviction. Maybe it was because he was far away from home? A fleeting smile appeared on Nephi's face. Far away from home. All right. After that, she turned away and lowered her head, becoming like a statue again. It seemed like their conversation was over. Grumbling internally, Sonny lay down and tried to fall asleep. However, the image of bleak-eyed Odysseus kept appearing in his mind. After a while, he whispered, Well? Did he make it back home? Soon, Nephi's replied. Yes. He returned to his wife and son, and they lived happily ever after. Satisfied, Sonny smiled and turned on his side. When he was already half asleep, he heard Changing Star's quiet voice once again. This time, it was barely audible and aimless, as though not directed at anyone. Odysseus was the first human to break the will of gods. In the morning, Sonny and Nephi's were the first to get up. While the sun was rising and the sea was retreating, They made a fire and began preparing a simple breakfast. With Kasia still asleep, they did not talk to each other much. It was like the last night's conversation did not happen. However, after some time, they somehow ended up discussing the plan for the next few days. Nephi's had some ideas. With what you told us about scavengers crowding to the west, the logical step would be to start moving east as soon as we can. Of course, north and south are also acceptable, but that won't put as much space between us and the enemy. Sunny nodded, agreeing with that logic. We have explored to the east a little, but not enough to confidently make it to the next high point in a day. That's why the best course of action would be to spend today scouting a path to that group of cliffs over there and move the camp tomorrow. He sighed. Do you have any idea where we are? Would there be a human citadel to the east? Nephi shook her head. I've never heard of a region that fits the characteristics of this place. In any case, we have to move to find out more. We'll either find a citadel, encounter an unconquered gateway, or die. East is as good of a direction as any. Plus, it's the safest, because there's a horde of monsters to the west. At that point, Cassie suddenly sat up straight. Her eyes were wide open, and her face was a little pale. She looked nervous and excited. Nephi's frowned. Cassie? What's the matter? The blind girl turned to them and smiled. A vision. I had a vision. Like a prophetic dream? Sunny thought, trying to come to terms with this new reality of someone being able to see the future. Or the past. Meanwhile, Changing Star stretched her hand, as though prepared to summon her sword. Are we in danger? Cassie energetically shook her head. No, it's not that. People. I saw a castle full of people. She smiled and pointed with her finger. I don't know how far it is, but I'm sure that it's in that direction. Sunny and Nephi's looked at each other, not knowing whether to be glad or petrified. Cassie's small, delicate finger was confidently pointing west. Chapter 39. In the ensuing silence, the smile slowly disappeared from Cassie's face, replaced by confusion. Feeling the sudden tension, she asked, what's wrong? Sunny sighed. No, nothing is wrong. It's just that that direction is the one we wanted to avoid. After some thought, he added, That's where I came from yesterday. There's a lot of scavengers down there. The blind girl's face fell. Oh. Nephi's, who was quietly listening to them, gave him an indecipherable look and finally spoke. Tell us more about the castle. A shadow of the previous excitement returned to Cassie's eyes. With a serious nod, she began describing her vision. I dreamt of a vast, ruined city built of weathered stone. It was surrounded by tall, impregnable walls. Various monsters were wandering its narrow streets. In the center of the city there was a hill, and on that hill stood a magnificent castle. She smiled. But there were no monsters in the castle. Instead, it was full of people. I'm sure that they were awakened. Some were guarding the walls, some were going about their lives without a care in the world. There was food, safety, and laughter. Well, that sounds great. If this castle really existed, then all of their problems would be solved. Sunny cleared his throat. Did you see anything else? Cassie frowned, trying to remember. Then, her face cleared. Yes. I saw Sunny leading me through the gates of the castle. That means we will make it. A brilliant smile appeared on her doll-like face, beaming with so much joy that Sunny couldn't help but curl his lips. Inwardly, however, he was stuck on a certain detail of Cassie's vision. It was that, when talking about reaching the castle, the blind girl only mentioned the two of them. Was there some meaning behind it? Sunny turned his head a little and secretly glanced at Nephi's, trying to discern if she had picked up on that little discrepancy. Changing Star, however, was as enigmatic as ever. Without showing much emotion, she thought for a while, and then slowly nodded. Okay. Then we will go west. While the sea was still retreating, they had their breakfast and then spent some time planning for the journey and preparing to abandon the temporary camp. In the process, Sunny had a chance to get to know the girls a little better. It was then that he came to a sudden realization, which almost made his head explode from bafflement. That mind-blowing realization had to do with Nephi's. Back when they first met in front of the Academy's gates, Sunny had formed a certain impression of the confident, distant girl. Later, her behavior and the different revelations about changing stars past only served to reinforce that impression. Nephi seemed to exist a bit apart from the world. She was mysterious, aloof, and rather cool. Her taciturn character and strange speech patterns made people interacting with her feel unnerved and rattled, often revealing more than they had been planning to. The less she talked, the more she seemed to know. That silent, indifferent confidence was arresting, and sometimes even oppressive. However, that impression turned out to be completely wrong. The actual truth behind the matter had nothing to do with being cool and aloof. After talking to her a bit more and observing their interactions with Cassie, Sunny almost fainted when he realized that Nephi's was simply an incredibly, ridiculously, painfully awkward person. It was as though she had no idea how to talk to people. Every time she tried to convey something, she would either use the wrong words or stumble in the middle of the sentence and fall silent. Her tone never matched what she was trying to say. Often, she would forget to put correct intonations in her speech, making questions sound like statements or vice versa. Added to that was the fact that, like many introverted people, Nephi's was not in a habit of openly showing her emotions. It's not that she didn't have feelings, it's just that she was really bad at emoting them. As a result, her face always looked cold and neutral. That's why, most of the time, she simply chose to talk as little as possible or not to talk at all. All of that added up together, then multiplied by her general weirdness, was ultimately responsible for creating the false image of a mysterious, unapproachable ice princess. When in fact, she was just shy and completely inept in communicating with people. After coming to that realization, Sunny tried with all his might but still failed to stop himself from staring at Nephi's with wide eyes. He just barely managed to not let his jaw hang open. What the hell? That's not in line with how a protagonist should be. In his mind, Nephi's had definitely been the type of person to be the main character of any event. At the center stage, there were always confident, strong people like her and Castor. People like himself and Cassie, on the other hand, were relegated to exist far away in the background. Now, however, no, that line of thought was also wrong. The fact that Changing Star had problems with expressing herself and lacked social skills did not mean that she was not strong. In fact, it might have meant the opposite. She still achieved everything that she had achieved, but with the added layer of adversity. She was still dangerous. At that moment, Nephi's finally noticed that Sunny was staring at her. She looked at him and, after a long pause, asked in an emotionless tone, "What?" He blinked, extricating himself from this sudden flood of thoughts, and cleared his throat. Nothing. I was just going to ask when are we setting off." Nephi's appeared to be thinking. After a while, she turned away and said, "Soon. You really can't manage more than one word, can you?" Utterly bewildered, Sunny hid his emotions and smiled. "Ah. All right then." In the gray light of morning, they abandoned the tall hill and ventured west, retracing their steps from yesterday. Knowing the path, the small party made quick progress. Nephi's was walking in front, her sword arm ready to strike at any moment. A bit behind her was Sunny. This time, the responsibility of holding the golden rope and guiding Cassie along was entrusted to him. Of course, the actual person, creature? Leading them was his shadow. It scouted ahead, carefully observing the labyrinth for signs of danger. The labyrinth was just as it was before, confusing and seemingly endless. Crimson blades of coral protruded from the black mud, creating a vast, tangled forest. However, today something about it felt different. It wasn't long before the shadow stumbled onto a mass of hulking, hungry scavengers. Chapter 40. "Halt!" Sunny whispered, observing the group of scavengers through his shadow. As soon as the word left his lips, Nephi's immediately summoned her sword. After studying the surroundings for a second, she turned her head and glanced at him with a question in her eyes. Kasha, meanwhile, froze in place and hesitantly raised her staff. Sunny counted the monsters: 1, 2, 3, 5. Curses. The hulking beasts seemed like the losers of the pack, similar to the one he had killed. However, their wounds were not as pronounced and terrible. Each of them was much more of a threat than the mangled one from before, and there were half a dozen of them at least. There are scavengers on the path ahead, 6 of them. They're slowly moving in our direction. Nephi's cast a gaze forward. There was a calculating look on her face. They're done with the carcass? Sunny thought for a moment, and then shook his head. No, I don't think so. But maybe there's not enough meat for everyone anymore, so some stragglers had no choice but to leave with an empty stomach. Nephi's nodded and gestured to a nearby branching path. We'll circle around them. The 3 sleepers hastily moved forward and changed paths, giving a wide berth to the group of monsters. Tense and grim, they continued walking, trying to stay on course and not get lost in the labyrinth. However, in the next hour, they had to turn in a random direction again and again, avoiding other scavengers. The distance between them and the giant statue was not shortening at all. At some point, they were catching their breath near one of the numerous dead ends of the Crimson Labyrinth. They had no choice but to wait, since a large number of creatures was moving past their hiding spot, separated from them by a long length of a twisting coral passage. Sunny sighed and shook his head. We can't go on like that. At this rate, we'll never make it to safety before sunset. Cassie was the first one to react. Maybe we should turn back? That was a reasonable suggestion. However, Sunny felt reluctant to agree. Nephi shared his thoughts. With a blank expression, she said, It will only get harder tomorrow. She was right. By tomorrow, there would be even more scavengers flooding the labyrinth. Then what should we do? Changing Star tilted her head, thinking. After a while, she turned to Sunny. Fight. Fight? Fight against dozens of those monstrosities? Was she crazy? Sunny tried to hide his derision as he spoke. I know that you are skilled with the sword, but have you forgotten that each of those things is a whole rank above us? We won't survive in a fight against many. Nephi's nodded. We avoid large groups. Cut down smaller ones. After a moment, she added. If there's 1 or 2 of them, there's a chance. Sunny wanted to retort, but couldn't find a good reason. In the end, he gave up. Fine. Nephi stared at him for a while. Then she suddenly asked, Have you studied the corpse of the scavenger you had killed? What was that supposed to mean? A bit surprised, Sunny shook his head. No. He was too busy being in pain and trying to make it to safety before the sea returned. And why would he study a corpse? Wait. I think Teacher Julius mentioned something. After a short pause, Nephi spoke. Scavengers have 3 weak points on their bodies. The first one is obvious, it's their joints. Anything that has to be flexible can't be too rigid. So, there's gaps in the armor above the joints. By targeting the joints, you can diminish their mobility and attack capacity. Oh, so, by studying a dead monster, one could better understand their strengths and vulnerabilities. This idea was so obvious that Sunny admonished himself for not realizing sooner. Meanwhile, Nephi's continued. The second one is the same. It's where their torso connects to the carapace. If you manage to accurately hit that spot, you can heavily injure a scavenger and deal serious damage to its body. However, unless you succeed in severing its spine, the wound won't be fatal. It'll still be able to fight for a while. Sunny couldn't help but notice that Changing Star's awkwardness seemed to disappear whenever she talked about things that she felt confident about, like ancient heroes. Or killing things. Curious. The last weak point is on their back, approximately at the level where the eyes are. There's a slightly concave, discolored cavity in their armor. It is where several armor plates connect. The chitin there is comparatively thin. If you can pierce through it, you can destroy the brain directly. That will be a killing blow. That is good to know. However, that weak point was too high to be hit by a human. After all, scavengers were more than 2 meters tall. As though reading his thoughts, Nephi's added. That weak point is very hard to target. Circling around a scavenger is almost impossible due to their size, speed, and the attack range of their pincers. She looked at him and calmly said, "If we stumble on a single scavenger, I'll be the bait. My task will be to make it turn around and then restrain it, exposing the third weak point. Your task will be to kill it." Sunny gulped. "What if there's two of them?" As usual, Nephi's paused before answering. "Don't die." It wasn't long before they were left with no choice but to attempt a fight against the scavenger. Behind them, there was a long stretch of the labyrinth with no suitable branching paths for them to turn onto. Ahead of them, there was a small clearing with only one other passage leading out of it. Not far into that passage, a massive scavenger was moving slowly in their direction. Sunny quickly described the situation and waited for Changing Star's feedback. Without much delay, she gave him a nod. "We fight in the clearing." After that, Nephi's gently guided Cassie to the wall of the labyrinth and helped her find a place to sit. "Wait here. We'll be back." After some thought, she added, "Soon." As Nephi's moved to walk away, Cassie grabbed her hand. Her face was pale and tense. "Neph, you be careful, okay?" Nephi's blinked and tilted her head a little. Then she smiled. Sure." With that, she and Sunny hastily headed for the clearing. By the time they got there, the scavenger was seconds from appearing. Sunny's shadow flew out of the passage and reattached itself to his feet. Without having to discuss things with Nephi's, he quickly hid in the shadows and waited there, hoping for a chance to attack. Nephi's, on the other hand, strolled to the center of the clearing and calmly stood there, her shoulders relaxed and her back straight. An elegant longsword appeared in her hands, carelessly pointed to the ground. Not knowing what else to do, Sunny silently repeated her words. "Don't die." A second later, the scavenger walked into the clearing. When his tiny eyes spotted Nephi's, an evil light ignited in them. Without wasting even a second, the massive monster screeched and rushed forward to attack. Its huge pincer shot forward with terrifying speed, tearing the air in its path. Nephi's swiftly sidestepped, dodging the pincer, then leaped backward, removing herself from the path of the rushing monster. Simultaneously, her sword flashed in the air, cutting deep into the joint of one of the scavenger's front legs. Azure blood spattered on the ground. Of course, this small wound was too insignificant to slow the scavenger down. With surprising agility, it twisted and delivered a crushing sideways swipe. Nephi's, who just barely landed on her feet, had no choice but to deflect the blow with her sword. She managed to disperse most of the impact by holding the blade at the right angle, but the remaining force was still enough to throw her off balance. At that moment, the second pincer came down. Instead of trying to regain her equilibrium, Changing Star went with the fall and somersaulted over one hand, ending up distancing herself from the monster a bit. Her sword lashed out again. The follow-up attack followed almost immediately. However, Sunny did not care about the details anymore. The only thing he cared about was that, through this risky series of dodges and leaps, Nephi's had managed to circle to the opposite side of the clearing, forcing the scavenger to turn its back to the shadow in which he hid. "It's now or never." Gritting his teeth, Sunny lunged forward. Before Changing Star finished her last dodge. Before the scavenger's pincer crashed on her from above. Before Sunny had time to become scared. He closed the distance between himself and the monster and jumped with all his might, landing on top of its carapace. Then, he used all of his weight to thrust a hand forward. Azure blade shimmered into existence in his grip and was immediately swallowed by the shadow. A breath later, the dark blade hit precisely into the concave, discolorated cavity in the scavenger's armor. With a crack, the chitin broke, allowing the tip of the sword to sink deep into the scavenger's body. The monster shuddered, and then heavily fell to the ground. Sunny was thrown from its carapace, landing in the mud with a roll. That easy? It was already over? As though to answer him, the spell's voice resounded in the air. "You have slain an awakened beast, carapace scavenger. Your shadow grows stronger."